Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the fate of small island countries threatened by climate change. And joining us from New York is Jeffrey Salim Waheed. He is the Maldives Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And from Dhaka, Bangladesh, via Skype, we are joined by Salimul Huq. He is a Senior Fellow at the Climate Change Group at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And joining us from Florida is John Englander. He's an oceanographer and author of the seminal work, High Tide on Main Street. Thanks so much for joining us, all three of you. Let's go to the UN. Obviously, the Deputy Ambassador Waheed, you are obviously right in the thick of this, being a representative of Maldives. Maldives, I understand, has the highest elevation is about 4.5 meters and is suffering the effects of climate change on a daily basis. What is happening there?
Absolutely. Indeed, our average elevation is only about 1.6 meters above the sea level. The situation is quite dire. The impacts of climate change is not something that we'll see 10 years from now. We can see it today. You have ocean acidification, you have coral bleaching, you have depleting fish stocks, you have water insecurity, you have changing weather patterns, increasing tidal variation, increasing precipitation, and of course you do have sea level rise. There's a lot that is happening in the Maldives, but at the same time, you know, the situation is not hopeless, and we are certainly not helpless. Together with our partners, we can implement efforts to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Even now in the Maldives, we are moving towards a low carbon economy. We have implemented integrated water projects. We have coastal protection systems, and we're even trying to build a more resilient economy. This is how we address the issues of climate change.
Jeff, as this Paris summit comes up, obviously you want money to help. There's $100 billion expected to come from developed countries to smaller countries like yourselves, but also many adaptation projects, because the world is still warming regardless and not expected to hit that 2 degrees Celsius barrier. In fact, your groups like yourself are calling for 1.5 Celsius, correct?
The reality is that even today, the global temperature has already risen by at least 0.8 degrees to 1 degree Celsius. We know that there are going to be impacts that are going to be felt by the lowest lying countries, by islands, and low-lying countries are not going to be able to get away from the impacts of climate change. And even in a 2-degree world, we're going to see significant impacts. We're going to see massive coastal erosion. We're going to see our economies put in jeopardy. It is incredibly important that we continue to strive for the most ambitious goals possible. And even under the current system that we hope is going to be a comprehensive agreement, we hope that ambition will be continually maintained, because that's the only way that we can survive.
John Englander in Florida, just how bad is it for small island nations and developing nations as well when it comes to the effects of climate change? A lot of them aren't actually responsible for climate change, but seem to reap the havoc that emitters have produced over all these decades.
Well, it is terribly serious, and this is one of those things that really cuts across developing nations and the developed world, not equally, but universally. And we tend to forget that, because it's from the Maldives to Miami, and it's from Boston to Bangladesh, as I like to say. The idea that sea level will be higher is a revolutionary concept. Sea level hasn't been higher than now for 120,000 years. We have no prior experience with it, but it's very clear in the geologic record. It's great that Jeff described the nuances or the very many aspects of climate change, from ocean acidification and changing storm patterns, et cetera. And he's absolutely right, saltwater intrusion in the water table. But I focus on sea level not to dismiss the others, but to help us remember that there's really 3 different parts of this problem. One is the greenhouse gases and the warming and the various limits or goals to restrict the warming. Then there are the various effects of climate change, which are nefarious and diverse. And then sea level is a little different and special, because sea level is already locked in. The glaciers have started melting. Even at the current level of warming the ocean, a considerable amount of sea level rise is inevitable. So I believe we need to do two things simultaneously. One is to work as hard as possible to affect those goals to limit the warming or reduce the threshold that we call the 2 degrees Celsius or the 1.5 degrees Celsius, whatever that goal is. But second and simultaneously is we must begin preparing for higher sea level, because that's now unstoppable. Because the oceans are warmer, the ice is melting, the sea is rising, and we're just seeing the beginning of it. We need to start planning higher, because it's really unprecedented in Earth's history that we have to plan for higher sea level.
Salim, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, how are you planning for that? And how should other developing nations plan for that? And what do we have to spend?
Well, Bangladesh is a very low-lying deltaic country. It lives on two of the major rivers of the world, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. And it has a population of 150 million people living in an area of less than 150,000 square kilometers. So the density of population is well over 1,000 people per square kilometer. And at the same time, it's a very poor country. And at the same time, the coastal area, particularly the Ganges delta part of it, is extremely low-lying. So what we are facing here at the moment is already, as the ambassador said, intrusion of seawater. People are having to drink saline water. We have to now find ways of providing them with fresh water. Irrigation water is also becoming saline, and we're having to come up with varieties of rice that can tolerate high salinity or change cropping patterns, go from rice to shrimp. But these are all short-term measures. In the longer run, we simply will not be able to continue livelihoods of fishing and farming that people have in the low-lying coastal areas. And they, or certainly their children over the next 10 to 20 years, will have to move. And we're looking at migration over a 10 to 20-year timescale of around 10+ million people. And the government is now thinking seriously about how do we make migration part of an adaptive strategy over the long run. And so, far from seeing migration as the problem, which it sometimes can be, it may well be the solution in this case.
I'm glad you talked about moving people. I want to bring in Jeff here, the Deputy Ambassador to the Maldives at the United Nations, because while Bangladesh might be able to move people around, it's very difficult when you're a small island, isn't it? I mean, for example, some Pacific islands are actually thinking of abandoning themselves altogether, moving to the United States, for example, like the Marshall Islands.
We have to think about what that means. My nation, my people, we have a tradition and a culture that does indeed span millennia. And leaving our islands represents not just the loss of our sovereignty, it represents the loss of our cultural identity, and everything that makes me a Maldivian is lost too. These are simply not options. We have to find ways to adapt. We have to find ways to mitigate, because the more we mitigate, the less we'll have to adapt, and the less losses and damages we'll see in the future. You know, you mentioned the GCF and the $100 billion that are pledged towards mitigation and adaptation measures.
The Green Climate Fund,
The Maldives was actually, the Green Climate Fund, yeah, sorry. The Maldives was actually very lucky to be one of the first recipients of this money. Now, the reality is, in the most recent the meeting, now the reality is that we have not been able to meet our pledges, even to the GCF. We have not been able to raise that $100 billion a year. And what we need to do is recognize that we are taking steps now, but we need to ramp up our pledges. We need to ensure that we're continually ambitious, that we get the money, that we ensure that this is provided for, because there are solutions now. We can find ways to adapt. We can find ways to mitigate.
Jeff, in an ideal world, if you got all the money you wanted to spend in the Maldives, what would you do? Would you reclaim land? Would you dredge? What would you do to make sure that your country that you represent there at the United Nations still exists in a couple of decades' time?
See, we're doing that even now. We are reclaiming land, we are dredging, we're building coastal protection systems. But we can't do it alone. This has to be, and this is, a global effort. At the end of the day, the Maldives emits a fraction of the amount that's released, a fraction of the carbon that's released into the atmosphere. The world needs to come together, and we're starting to see that. We're actually starting to see a lot of momentum going into Paris, and it's imperative that this momentum is kept up, that it comes to fruition in a comprehensive agreement, and that that ambition is maintained in the years to come. Paris is just the beginning. And we have to recognize that.
John, I want to bring you in again from Florida, because isn't, in a way, the Maldives a test case? If you save the Maldives, you basically save the rest of the planet, right?
Yeah, but there's a big misunderstanding here. Even if we got the 1.5-degree goal that he suggests, and even if the world went 100% solar today, if we never used another particle of fossil fuel, sea level is still going to rise 3 or 4 feet. So I fully support, I've been to the Maldives. I was there on a diving holiday many years ago, and it's a wonderful country. And I lived in the Bahamas half my life, so I'm very sensitive to what's at stake here that the ambassador describes. And he's not overstating it at all. But we must not confuse setting a goal of 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius and policies to get us off fossil fuels and reduce the warming with stopping sea level rise. The glacier melt from Alaska to Greenland and what the loosening of the glaciers in Antarctica is underway. We can slow it from getting catastrophic. We can't stop it.
So you think the Maldives will go before we can mitigate this?
Well, it's not, the time frame is what's confusing. When you talk about decades, it's not going to be quite that quick. I mean, it's already started as he described, but extreme sea level rise won't happen for 20 or 30 years at the earliest. Some people would say it's going to be a couple of 100 years. We need to begin preparing for much higher sea levels. If the Maldives, I doubt they could protect all their islands, knowing how diverse they are with dozens or hundreds of islands and very, very low to the ocean. But there may be some that they can slowly build up over the next 20 or 30 years so that they can make the evolution into a world of 3 or 4 feet higher sea level. But we need to think that way. We must slow the warming, as the Paris discussions hopefully will put on the table. We must do things to reduce the greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide. We must deal with the other effects, such as ocean acidification on fishing and things that the ambassador described. But then we must prepare for higher sea level. Right. It's not stoppable. We can't fool ourselves into thinking that Paris can stop sea level from rising.
Okay, I want to go back to Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Salim. I want to ask you a question about what Bangladesh is doing in terms of itself cutting emissions. You know, a rapidly growing population, rapidly developing country. There's also on low-lying areas, but also you have a plan for Paris too, right? And could perhaps lead the way in terms of other developing nations.
Indeed, Bangladesh has recently submitted its climate change plan, which in the UNFCCC, or the Framework Convention on Climate Change jargon, we call an INDC, which is an intended nationally determined contribution, or basically what we are prepared to do to reduce our own emissions. And basically what the country has proposed is we can reduce our own emissions from a business as usual scenario by about 5% on our own without any help from anyone. But we could do a lot more if we got some help, both technological and financial. And we have offered to go to a 15% reduction by 2030 if we get technology and finance. But having said that, on our own, without additional support, we are now in Bangladesh the fastest growing solar home systems in the world. We just crossed 4 million households who have installed solar panels for their own lighting and use at home. And at the moment, I believe Bangladesh accounts for about roughly half of global solar homes around the world. So we are already doing quite a lot on the mitigation front, even though our emissions are a tiny fraction of global emissions. Nevertheless, we are doing what we can because it's the right thing to do.
I want to end, obviously, by going back to the Maldives Deputy Permanent Representative at the United Nations. You know, Jeff, everyone's going to Paris in a few weeks. Everyone is going to Paris with different agendas. The Pacific Islanders are known for their charm and their warmth, but there's a lot of politicians in the area getting very angry and very serious. Is that going to be the position from these islands in Paris?
We're hoping that in leading the Alliance of Small Island States and leading small island developing states, that the Maldives will be able to bring a lot of these countries together. And our goal as islands is to have a fair and ambitious deal that does take into account mitigation, finance, adaptation, and loss and damage as well. there are going to be permanent effects, there are going to be permanent impacts of climate change, and we do have to ensure that those are addressed. We're hoping that they will be, and we're very optimistic going into this Paris negotiation.